Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and this is my review of the fourth episode of Season 3 of Star Trek Picard, called No Win Scenario. And in my opinion, it was kind of a disappointing episode, not because it was bad, but because I think it could have been better in many ways, and so I personally was a bit disappointed. Also, a lot of stuff here felt kind of cheap, the same way like in Season 1. Remember when Picard didn't have a room on Rio's ship, that he went into the holodeck to sit in a recreation of his room in his house, which was shown in the first episodes. And so whenever he was on the ship, he was still in the same set, basically, because they didn't have enough sets. So they do the same thing in this show, in which they constantly go to Guinan's bar from the previous season because they don't have any other sets. And so that kind of felt a bit lazy and cheap as well. And the episode actually begins with a flashback taking place in that bar, and also in the dialogue in this episode, he made it sound as if he knows that bar so well, as if he was going there for years. And yet, in the previous season, when he first went to meet Guinan in that bar, he was kind of looking around as if it's the first time he was ever there. So it doesn't seem to fit. So anyway, he goes into this bar and he sits down to eat, and is then approached by a big group of Trekkies who are all wearing Star Trek uniforms and start bothering Patrick Stewart with questions about Star Trek. Oh wait, this is actually Picard being approached by a group of cadets, but it actually felt like those kinds of stories which the actor often tells about his daily life. And I think in one of his stories he told that right after he finished Star Trek TNG, he went back to theater and did a play, and in the middle of the play he suddenly noticed that the entire front row in the audience were all dressed in Starfleet uniforms, and it completely shocked and annoyed him, because he realized they all came there not to watch Patrick Stewart, but because he's Picard, that all the Trekkies came to visit him because he was in Star Trek. And so this scene really reminded me of that and kind of made me laugh. Of course, here in the actual scene, it is Picard being approached by cadets of Starfleet who know that he's a legend and all of that. And what's funny about this scene is that it kind of retcons the mistake they did in the first season when Picard went to Starfleet Command and no one even recognized him. That ensign who met him didn't know who he was. Even after he gave him his name, he wanted to know how to spell it because he never heard about him. And the entire first season of Picard, everyone were hating on him and humiliating him and all of that. And suddenly here it's the opposite. Here everyone knows him and loves him and he's a legend and all of that, which makes more sense, but it kind of contradicts the first season now, so that makes it even stranger. And by the way, that was one of the scenes I fixed for my fan edit of season 1. I'm turning the entire first season into kind of a short movie and fixing a lot of those issues I had with it. So in my fan edit, when Picard approaches that ensign, the ensign immediately gives him a badge and immediately greets him, not asking for his name and all of that. So that made the impression that he immediately recognized him. I removed all the silly parts about the guy not knowing who he was. And I will eventually release that fan edit. It's a lot of work because I basically have to fix 99% of it, but it will become like a decent short movie in the end, I hope. So anyway, the cadets want to hear about his stories, and one of them asks him about the time he met the Hirogen, and that annoyed me when I first heard it because that's a species from Voyager, from the Delta Quadrant. But then they did ask, did you ever find out how they got to this quadrant? And so that means they are aware that they're not supposed to be anywhere near the Federation, that they did get here, and they even asked, did you get some advice from Admiral Janeway? So that makes it okay. So anyway, Picard kind of gives them the typical Picard speeches about how they should rely on each other to be a good crew and to help each other out and all of that stuff. And in the very end of the episode, it's revealed that Jack was actually there, that he did come to try to talk with Picard. And as all those cadets were asking questions about Starfleet and treating him as a celebrity and all of that, suddenly Jack, who is wearing civilian clothes, he asks him, what about your life outside of Starfleet? Did you ever think about the family and stuff like that? And then Picard kind of looks sad, but then says, Starfleet is all the family I ever needed. And all the cadets clap for him and all of that, but Jack looks sad and then goes away. So that's the reason he didn't end up telling him, because he thought Picard doesn't want to have a son and all of that. Of course, Picard only said that to kind of hide his pain of not having a family. Obviously, you know, his remaining family died in a fire, which I wish the show would have addressed at least once. It was never once mentioned in this entire show about the fact that his family died in a fire and all of that. It was never brought up. So also missed opportunity in my opinion. If they want to have all these tragic backstories and to deal with trauma and all of that, why not bring something which was previously established? Why invent new things to deal with while ignoring all the old stuff? So anyway, maybe Picard only said that to hide his pain that he did want a family and he lost his family and all of that, but Jack misunderstood it and got offended himself and went away, and Picard only remembers that incident in the very end of this episode. And also, how come in this episode the holodeck already knew how to create that bar? Like, when did Picard have time to program the new ship's holodeck of all these details of a place that he knew and visited, and it even knew about his bottle being there in the bar? How could the ship's computer know that when he didn't have a chance to program it? So I assume that Riker programmed it from before, when he was still the captain of the Titan, otherwise it wouldn't make any sense. And another small nitpick that I forgot about in the previous episode, when Troy said that their son threw up 4 feet in the air in engineering. That was annoying because in Star Trek they always made sure to use the metric system, which is, the more universal measuring system that most of humanity uses nowadays, and yet they kind of forgot about it in this show, and suddenly they're not talking in meters but in feet. And also I wonder, does the holodeck create actual alcohol and not synthahol, since what is the point of them going there to drink all the time if it doesn't give them a buzz and all of that? So that's a bit strange. In this episode, the ship is almost completely out of power, and yet they go into the holodeck, which is working fine. And at least again they acknowledge it, because Jack actually asks Picard directly how come the holodeck is still working when the ship has no power, and then Picard says that the holodeck uses a separate independent power source, so it's not affected by the rest of the ship. And at first it annoyed me because I remember specifically in TNG, in the episode Booby Trap, Geordi was doing stuff in the holodeck with, the woman he fell in love with, and then the holodeck suddenly shut off because there wasn't enough power, and he had to specifically ask Picard to tell the computer to give the holodeck the necessary power to finish his simulation. But later in Voyager they did say that their holodeck systems use some kind of different power source which cannot be connected with the rest of the ship, something like that, which was kind of an excuse for why the holodecks were always working and the holographic doctor was always working, even when there was a power shortage and even when they had to use replicator rations and all of that, and yet they could always go into the holodeck. So they kind of explained that away in one episode by saying that the holodeck uses some different energy which is incompatible with the other ship system, something like that. So that makes this scene okay. And the only thing I do like about it is that maybe that explains why they couldn't shut off the holodeck in all those episodes in which they got stuck in the holodeck and were in mortal danger because the safeties were off and they were stuck in some program. Why couldn't they simply turn it off? So at least that explains that. All those times in which they couldn't simply shut it off, maybe because the holodeck has its own independent power source, so it cannot be shut off from the outside, even though that makes it silly as well, because if the holodeck is kind of a death trap in so many situations, they might not have an off switch to quickly shut it off when you need to. So anyway, there's a lot of logical problems, but it started with the previous shows, so I cannot blame this show for doing the same thing. So anyway, the ship is almost out of power and they only have a few hours of life support left, and they're falling into the middle of the nebula. And Riker comes to talk with Picard, and he doesn't directly apologize for the ending of the previous episode, but he does tell him that he was right when he accused him of being too cautious because of that fear of loss, because he lost his son and all of that. And he starts talking with him about that and telling him about that time in which he watched his son being buried in a coffin, and he said he watched the coffin being lowered into the ground. And at first I got annoyed by that line because of the technicality of why are they using coffins again, since in TNG they always show that whenever someone died they would eject their body into space, and Earth is probably overpopulated, so people wouldn't be using coffins anymore to bury people. But then I remember that Riker and Troy went to live on that planet Nepenthe with their son because they thought maybe the planet will heal him. They implied that the planet has some kind of rejuvenating properties, which kind of annoyed me, because why didn't they go to the Baku planet from Insurrection, which actually did have those properties? So why didn't they go there? And so instead they went to some other planet hoping that the environment will cure him. So anyway, that planet did have plenty of room to bury people on, and so it's not a problem. Also in that episode when Beverly's grandmother died, they also buried her in a coffin, and so I guess it's still being practiced. So anyway, Riker says that he's been depressed so much that, he doesn't feel anything, and Troy couldn't stand being with him because she cannot feel him anymore, which kind of contradicts season 1 because they seemed happy on that planet. Yes, they were a bit sad that their son died, but they had another daughter and they seemed to be happy on that planet, and yet suddenly Riker is actually completely and utterly devastated and depressed and that he came here to escape that darkness he felt. And it's a bit strange how come the outer parts of the nebula were glowing red and yet the middle of the nebula is so dark. Like the physics of this nebula doesn't really make much sense. Maybe the material itself there somehow blocks the light from whatever sources of light were on the outskirts of the nebula. So anyway, a lot of things here don't really make much sense if we actually analyze them. And then Riker says that we've been to the edges of the universe and yet I never saw anything to make me think there's life after death, something like that. And that line also kind of annoyed me because, they saw so many fantastical things in the show. All the energy entities they encountered, beings like Q, who are basically all powerful, the fact that they know about parallel universes existing. So how can you say something like you don't think there can be life after death after witnessing all those fantastical things? Q even once took Picard into a kind of afterlife. Worf visited some other universes and came back. So even just that, knowing that there are infinite other universes in which copies of you exist, that alone means that his son is still alive in some other universe. And so wouldn't that make him feel better? So I don't kind of get Riker's sudden depression that, oh, there's nothing after this life and all of that, after he already saw so many amazing things. And he's literally talking to a resurrected Picard in this very same scene. Picard actually died in season 1 and got his consciousness uploaded into a synthetic body. And he's talking with him right now, saying that he never saw anything proving the afterlife. So I don't buy that line in this scene. So it's good for dramatic reasons and all of that, but it makes no sense in the context of all the things he saw and knows about. So meanwhile, Seven is looking for the Changeling all by herself, and she goes into the room of that ensign who got replaced by the Changeling and finds his dead body. And when she goes around the room, she kind of holds the phaser at least, but why doesn't she do a phaser sweep? And it seems to me like this show forgot that Changelings can actually turn into objects, not just other people. So it can easily be anything in the room, and it can be even part of the wall or the floor or the ceiling. It can be anywhere. So the only way to be sure is to simply phaser sweep the entire room, and yet she doesn't. And so that kind of annoyed me because it makes me feel as if the show forgot about their abilities, and the Changelings do seem to be a lot weaker in this show. And that's one of the most disappointing things in this episode, because when they made the big reveal in the previous one, I assumed this episode will be similar to the Deep Space Nine episode, The Adversary, in which there was a Changeling on the Defiant, and so the entire crew suddenly turned paranoid and they had to split into small groups and no one should be left alone, and they kept phasering and sweeping the entire ship looking for the Changeling, and the Changeling managed to somehow trick them. Even when they were doing blood tests, it was still able to somehow trick them. And so the Changeling was really powerful in that episode, and it was really kind of scary, and the crew itself was kind of arguing with each other because of paranoia. And so that was a brilliant episode. I think it was partly inspired by that movie The Thing, which had similar scenes of people, tying each other up and making them do blood tests to find out which of them is the alien and stuff like that. So I don't think that episode of Deep Space Nine was completely original, but at least it was kind of their version of the same idea and done really well. So I thought and hoped that this episode will be something like that and maybe even better, but instead it was very disappointing. In the end, the Changeling on the ship turned out to be just a small inconvenience. And even Riker didn't seem worried about it when Seven told him about it. Riker said that there's basically no point to look for the Changeling since the ship is going to be destroyed soon anyway, so there's no point to damage the crew morale or something. So he said to Seven, go and look for the Changeling, but do it on your own basically. Don't alert the crew, which is kind of silly because why not? Why not make it more difficult for the Changeling? It simply could have been more fun for the episode. Like if this episode was more like that Deep Space Nine episode, it could have been much more exciting and tenseful, and with that psychological element of the crew not trusting each other. And in the end, the Changeling was so easily taken out and it was barely an inconvenience. And so that's really annoyed me. That's one of the big missed opportunities of this episode. And so Seven goes to Captain Shaw for advice, and he told her that Changelings have to use a bucket to rest, that they cannot maintain their humanoid form for long and have to put themselves in a bucket. And he shows her a picture of Odo and his bucket from Deep Space Nine, which is a nice reference, but the problem is that Odo only used the bucket in the first seasons of DS9, when he didn't have his own quarters. He was basically living in his office, but later on he got himself quarters, and he said that he no longer uses the bucket, he just lets himself turn into a liquid anywhere in the room that he wants. and he used the bucket to put some flowers in it or something, so he didn't have to use a bucket. And yet now they say that no, all the changelings have to use buckets, and the buckets for some reason have to look exactly like Odo's bucket. I guess one way to explain that is by saying that since all the changelings got here from the wormhole, that means their first stop must have been Deep Space Nine, so maybe they shopped at the same place in which Odo got his bucket. So the first thing all the changelings did were buy themselves the same kind of bucket, which was either of Cardassian or Bajoran design, I guess, and that's why their buckets looks exactly like Odo's bucket. I guess I can't explain that. So anyway, Seven finds the changeling's bucket, and she sees there's some residue in it. There's still a bunch of goo in it, which also makes no sense, since if every time a changeling turns liquid, it will leave some pieces of him behind, then he will lose mass every time he shapeshifts, which is not how it works, and it makes no sense for it to work that way, and yet that's what they show us here. So she goes to some lab to scan the sample of the changeling so that the ship's sensors will be able to pick up the changeling, and I'm screaming at the screen saying that's not how it works. If it was so easy, then the changelings would not have been able to infiltrate the Federation and the Klingon Empire and do all the mess they did in Deep Space Nine. And it's so silly because, you know, Dr. Mora was said to be working with Starfleet to be able to detect changelings, and Odo himself was donating samples of himself to Starfleet and all of that to help them find the changelings, and they still couldn't find them. And yet here Seven can simply scan that pot and to be able to do it. So I guess the only way to explain that is by saying that maybe she only went around the corridor saying that in order to lure the changeling, to make the changeling think it might be possible, so that the changeling will attack her, and that way to expose it. There was never any serious intention to scan it. Maybe she had that same conversation multiple times in the corridors simply to make the changeling expose itself that way, that it will anger the changeling into attacking her. And that's exactly what happens. What annoys me in the scene, he could have shot her from the back, but instead he decides to first shoot the other officer there and only then to try to shoot at Seven. So that gives Seven the chance to react, and he also aims at the bucket itself. He vaporizes the bucket while it is in Seven's hand, and somehow Seven is totally fine. She's not scorched by it. Even though a metal bucket was just vaporized in her hand, she's completely fine. Maybe it's because she's Borg, maybe she's more resilient, but it still annoyed me. It's the same problem I had in Discovery, in which they had scenes like, you know, someone vaporizing some plate on the table, and it leaves no scorch marks, no damage around it, completely cleanly vaporizes just the one object, which makes it look and feel much less realistic. So the same thing here, the changeling aims at the bucket. Why not first shoot Seven herself, who is a threat, and then destroy the bucket? Why do you aim specifically at the bucket first? So that makes the changeling seem kind of stupid, and then she shoots the changeling multiple times until it escapes into some vent in the corridor, and then for some reason she stops shooting it. She quietly watches it going into the wall and doesn't keep shooting it for some reason. And also the special effect of the changeling looks really different from how it was in Deep Space Nine, and I don't have a problem with the special effect itself, since it does look like an organic material and all of that, but it kind of looks more meaty and less liquidy, and so it seems like a totally different species of changelings. And maybe they can explain it some way by saying that maybe these changelings are weaker because they're still infected by that virus which Section 31 made. Maybe that cure that Odo gave them was not 100% efficient. Maybe it somehow changed them and made them weaker and something like that. So that could explain a lot of these issues, but I'm betting it's not going to be explained, and that's just how it is. They're just 25% different changelings for some reason which will not be explained. And the biggest logical problem with the changeling being on the ship, and they said it was there before they ever met Beverly and all of that, so if that's the case, why didn't it simply replace the captain, so that when they met the Shrike, he could simply give the order to give Jack over to them, which is what they wanted, and that would have been it. So why didn't the changeling do it? So the changeling seemed to be much stupider and much weaker than they were before. And speaking of Jack, when he's in the bar with Picard, the first thing he asks is when did he lose his hair? And then Picard says, you should enjoy it while you can, something like that, which is kind of a funny scene, but again, it makes no sense in the context of Star Trek, in which I'm sure there must be a cure for that, and he simply chose to go bald because that's his personal fashion choice. He doesn't have to be bald in this future in which they have all the amazing medical technology. And so the joke wouldn't really make sense in that context, because Jack is not really worried about losing his hair, because I'm sure he can prevent himself from losing hair or give himself new hair if he does. and it's simply Picard personally who chose not to. So I wish they would have somehow acknowledged that. If they quickly said something like that, he could have said, I shaved my head before I even started to go bald naturally. That would explain that scene in Nemesis when a picture of him in the academy in which he was already bald, even though in the flashback scene with Beverly he did have hair and all of that. So they could have explained that away somehow, but instead they just went with the same kind of joke, which was in that episode with TNG when he met his fake son, and he also poked a joke at his hair and all of that. And speaking of the changelings, we have a scene of Vadik being on her ship and suddenly coming over to some table and taking a knife out and cutting off her own hand, which is then turns into the changeling liquid. And that scene confused the hell out of me, because why would a changeling need to use a knife to cut a piece of himself off? They can simply remove it at will. At least that's how it was in Deep Space Nine. And I remember a specific scene when Odo was giving Dr. Bashir a sample of himself to study, and he kind of melted his own finger into a cup and disconnected it. So there is no problem for changelings to disconnect parts of their bodies if they want to. So how come she has to use a knife to cut a piece of herself off? And also she seems to react with pain when she cuts off her hand, so why is it painful? Why does she have facial scars if she's a changeling? So many things don't really make much sense. I do kind of like her hair now, because now it makes sense why her hair is kind of glued to her forehead, which I remember poking fun at, saying it's like Hitler's hair and all of that. But since she's a changeling, it kind of makes sense, since I guess it's easier to make hair which is not sticking out of your body too much and all of that. So her hair being like that kind of makes sense now, but why is she struggling to cut off a piece of herself? So it makes me suspect that the makers of the show simply don't remember all these details as I do, and so that annoys me, unless again they explain it somehow. If they say these changelings are somehow weaker than the old ones, that they are still infected by a virus which limits their abilities, something like that, then I could buy it, but I'm betting there will not be any such explanation. And then the weirdest thing happens when the remains of her hand start floating above the table and form a giant talking skull which gives her orders. So this scene kind of confused me at first. I thought maybe she's not actually a changeling, that only part of her body is a changeling, maybe keeping her alive because of some injuries she suffered, and so she simply wants to talk with this changeling who is controlling her basically, because it's literally keeping her alive, because maybe her real body got heavily injured and disfigured, and so she has to have this changeling as part of her to keep her alive. But it doesn't really make any sense, since the changeling cannot be part of her all the time. It does need to liquefy once in a while. So I'm assuming she just uses her biomass to talk with someone else, some other entity which is sending a transmission, and not talking with a changeling which is part of her own body. So I think also because just before the scene they showed her ship leaving the nebula, presumably to make the transmission. And that is a nice detail, because previously they said that they cannot send transmissions from within the nebula. So it makes sense for them to first leave the nebula to send the transmission before going back. And so presumably she just uses her biomass to talk with some other villain who is their bigger boss, maybe some other changeling or some other entity which they will reveal later is giving them orders and sending its own image into her biomass to float in it. It kind of reminds me of, Darkseid in the Snyder Cut movie, appearing to someone out of some piece of metal which he shapeshifts into it, and so maybe it was inspired by that. So I'm assuming all of this stuff will get explained later. I hope it makes sense by the end. And also, if Vadik is indeed a changeling, then how the hell was she smoking in the previous episodes? Because I specifically remember Odo saying that he doesn't have a sense of smell and he doesn't have lungs and all of that. So if she's a changeling, how is she able to smoke and enjoy the smoke and all of that if she's a full changeling? So hopefully they'll reveal that maybe she's part human, who only agreed to work with the changelings in exchange for her life. So maybe parts of her body are made from the changeling stuff simply to keep her alive. So anyway, the floating skull tells her that she has to find Jack Crusher at all costs, that her entire ship and all her people are expendable, and she has to find him, and it will be suicide for her to refuse, something like that. So I keep wondering what is so important about him. And in the end of the episode, they show us that he again has a strange hallucination, that he sees some apocalyptic vision and hears a strange voice telling him to come and find her or something like that. So he's obviously has some kind of psychic connection to something which the villain is afraid of. Maybe he has the same traveler powers as Wesley, since he's also the son of Beverly Crusher. Maybe it's because Beverly's entire family was having sex with an anaphasic life form. That ghost from Sub Rosa was with her family for centuries. Maybe that somehow made her give birth to children with some traveler powers. Wesley could freeze time and do stuff like that. So maybe Jack has the same potential of the same kind of abilities. So I'm hoping it will make sense by the end, because it sounds kind of convoluted at this point. So anyway, in order to chase them deeper into the nebula, the Shrike first has to eject that portal gun they had, because they say it has some graviton particles which they cannot take deep into the nebula for some reasons. So they eject it, presumably to pick it up later, and we see that it even says Daystrom on the device. So that means the Daystrom Institute actually assembled this complete portal gun, basically, and the Shrike simply stole it as it was, since it still has the Daystrom name on it. So that was also a little bit silly. It's as if they were afraid we wouldn't know what it was unless they showed it on the screen that it's the Daystrom device. So that was a little bit silly. And I wonder, will they even pick it up later? I kind of assumed the Changelings also wanted the portal weapon to basically bypass the Bajoran wormhole, which is still guarded by the Prophets, I guess. So maybe they need to open another wormhole to get some Jem'Hadar forces into the quadrant to take it over and all of that. And now apparently it's not even important for them. So they just eject the portal weapon and let it float somewhere in the nebula. And it's not clear if they will even pick it up later or not. So anyway, Picard is still bonding with Jack in the bar, and he tells him about his namesake, the original Jack Crusher that he's named after, who was his best friend. And he says that one time they wanted to get laid, and so they borrowed the shuttle to take it somewhere, and then they got hit by a meteorite shower in space. And that really annoyed me, because by definition a meteor is an asteroid which enters the atmosphere. So if it happens in space, it's still an asteroid, it's not called a meteorite. And yet apparently it hit them in space and it disabled their shuttle and they got stuck somewhere in space. And so that line once again shows me that the writers don't fully get the settings and the context of their own show. So that annoyed me. And then Picard says they had to manually pilot the shuttle back, and it took them 10 fucking grueling hours. That's according to him. So since when is Picard talking like that? And then Captain Shaw suddenly comes in, and he's walking with a cane, and he says he's on pain medication, and he's behaving like a total asshole. And I keep thinking about, was this inspired by Dr. House? Because he seems very similar to him, the way that he's totally honest and saying whatever he wants to say. And he's being an asshole to everyone, and he's walking with a cane and using medications. And so, was this inspired by Dr. House? It kind of feels like it. And then he reveals that he hates Picard because of Wolf 359, which is what we all guessed in that scene when he was being angry about former Borg drones and not wanting Seven to use the name Seven and being hostile toward Picard for some reason. And so now it's revealed it's because he hates him for being Locutus, which is not his fault. And it kind of made sense back in Deep Space Nine, because it was shortly after, like Cisco just lost his wife, and yet Shaw is still angry over 30 years later. It's been over 30 years since that battle, and he's still angry at Picard specifically, even though he knows it's not his fault when he had 30 years to think about it. So I don't really buy it, and so that annoyed me. I did like that line when he said he was so deadly as a Borg that they even gave him a goddamn name, which is an interesting point. Why did the Borg give him a name? And he even called himself I and all of that, which doesn't make sense. Maybe they wanted to show to humanity that you do still have some kind of individuality as a Borg or something. Maybe they wanted to ease humanity into the collective. There's another interesting line when he says, despite the strange things about the Stargazer, he was referring to season 2, that the real Borg are still out there. So he's kind of dismissing the silly thing they did, as if the Borg turned good in the end of season 2. He's saying, no, the real Borg are still out there and all of that. So the scene itself is not bad, but there are some logical problems with it. Everything is kind of over-exaggerated for the sake of drama, and it's kind of strange. And Picard doesn't reply to him. He just kind of feels ashamed and just walks away. And that annoyed me, because it feels again like season 1 of the show, when everyone just hates Picard and he keeps apologizing to everyone, even for things which was not his fault. So I kind of wanted him to reply something to him, to stand up to him for a change, and yet he didn't. He just walked away. And then Beverly meets Picard in the corridor, and she tells him that those energy waves from the nebula are actually contractions, that the nebula is like a giant womb, and they're floating in its amniotic fluid. Those energy waves are literal contractions because the nebula is about to give birth to something. And this whole scene was a little bit too silly in my opinion, because how would she know any of that? Just because she measured the time between the waves, she immediately jumps to this conclusion, which turns out to be right. But I have no problem with all the exotic, strange science fiction ideas of all kinds of strange anomalies and strange life forms. I'm fine with all of it. But the fact that she jumped to this conclusion from no evidence whatsoever, just because there are those waves coming, and it somehow reminds her of human contractions when giving birth. So that was kind of too silly in my opinion. And then Jack has the idea that since those energy waves give them literal energy on the ship, it literally turns on the lights. He says maybe they can use that wave to power themselves to get out of there before the big explosion, because Beverly says it keeps increasing like a countdown, and that pretty soon there will be a giant birth explosion which will destroy them if they don't get out. And that's also silly, because what a convenient timing that just as they got into the nebula, that's exactly the time that it's given birth. Like, it couldn't have happened before or after. It's exactly when they're in there. Like, that is also kind of annoying, because it's kind of too convenient timing for the episode. For the sake of the script, it happens just as they're there, so that's also silly. And when trying to explain all of this to Riker, Beverly says that they met many life forms in the past who live and thrive in space, and then Picard specifically mentions Farpoint, in which they met those giant jellyfish aliens in space. And again, what a coincidence that that's exactly the same kind of aliens that they see in the end of this episode. Why didn't he mention the crystalline entity, or that space ravioli creature which they accidentally killed, or the space whales from Discovery, since it's now part of the timeline and all of that? So they could have mentioned so many other things, but they specifically mentioned the jellyfish from Farpoint, which is exactly the aliens that they did end up seeing after the nebula gave birth. So I don't like all these convenient coincidences in this episode. So anyway, they have to use every last bit of remaining energy to accelerate themselves to be able to catch that wave, and then Riker says it's too risky and he doesn't want to do it, and that also annoyed me, because what do they have to lose if they're about to die anyway very soon? Why not take the chance, even if it's very unlikely to succeed? Why not risk it if you're going to die anyway? So that was also a little bit silly, how Riker doesn't want to take any risks, even though it makes no sense if they're about to die anyway. In the end, he does agree, and then they need to open up the nacelles to allow for that energy to go directly into the warp core to charge the ship, and they have to avoid all the asteroids on the way as they're riding the wave out. And they have to use every last bit of energy to first accelerate to be able to catch that wave, and then they have to shut off even life support, and then they say they would only have a few minutes to live without life support, and that also annoyed me. And that's a mistake that many of the previous Star Trek shows did as well, that they always said that if you shut off life support you only have minutes to live, which makes no sense, because they are in such big rooms that you would think the oxygen there would last for a few hours even if you completely shut off all life support. And yet they always say that you're not able to survive more than a few minutes without life support. Maybe it could make sense if they said there is so much hull damage that everything is leaking, and so once they lose power they will leak all the air out very quickly if it's not been regenerated and all of that. So they could have explained that away, but they just say no, if we shut off life support you have to take a big breath and you'll die in a few minutes, even though they're standing in a big room full of air. And so it never really made much sense to me. And how come they have no backups? Why don't they wear life support suits? Are you telling me a starship doesn't have those? At least some spare oxygen tanks lying around or something. So no, if you lose life support you die in a few minutes right away. So that always annoyed me. And then it's only Shaw and Seven who are working on redesigning the nacelles to allow for all of this to work. And then Ensign LaForge enters the room, and she says she's here to help because her father is the greatest engineer in Starfleet, so of course she can help them as well. And then Seven points a gun at her and asks her to say her name, and then she calls her Commander Hansen and not Commander Seven, and that's when she shoots her, and then the Changeling falls down dead, and it kind of morphs, but it stays in the shape of LaForge for some reason, looking like the corpse of LaForge and not liquefying or turning to ash or anything. So that also annoyed me. So anyway, the plan works and they're able to catch the energy of that explosion, since the nebula suddenly is giving birth to the jellyfish aliens, and all the energy goes into the nacelles and into the warp core, and the ship suddenly has power again, and they're able to ride that wave out. And Picard is navigating the ship. He's sitting at the captain's chair finally and navigating the ship in between all those asteroids. It does kind of remind me of that episode in TNG when he did something similar. And then, just as they're about to clear the asteroid field, they see the Shrike in front of them, and then Riker uses the tractor beam to catch an asteroid and throw it at the Shrike, and it causes it massive damage. So that's kind of poetic justice, because that ship threw another ship at them using a tractor beam earlier, so now they're taking revenge on it, I guess. It also reminds me of that line by Riker in an episode of TNG when also the ship wasn't working, and then he said, "Find me some rocks to throw at them." And I even remember I made an edit of that. I used to do a lot of TNG edits, and I remember using that line and then showing the Enterprise using a tractor beam to catch an asteroid, and then implying as if they threw it at a planet or something. So I did exactly the same thing myself, simply with editing. So I did get a kick out of seeing it here. And then just as they're leaving the nebula, they see that all of it is turning into a whole swarm of those jellyfish aliens, similar to the ones in Farpoint, but not exactly like them. It looks kind of different. They have eyes, they have different tentacles to the ones we saw. Maybe it's their baby form, maybe the same couple we saw in Farpoint are the ones who impregnated this nebula. I guess it's possible. And I also think it's a missed opportunity. First of all, it annoys me that all of this happened by coincidence at exactly the time that they were in there. Like, it all happened at just the right time for no apparent reason. And the missed opportunity here, I think what they should have done is saying that maybe those aliens somehow got affected by them. Because, in Farpoint, they established that those jellyfish aliens can read your thoughts and turn them into reality. That they can take energy and reorganize it into whatever form they want, into any matter they want, and so they're making your wishes come true, basically. So what I think they should have done is imply that maybe them being in the nebula and their thoughts influencing the aliens, that somehow accelerated that birthing process. And maybe because Riker kept thinking about his dead son, maybe to have a scene in which he will actually see a manifestation of his son by those aliens. Just like in Farpoint, the aliens were able to make your wishes come true. Maybe they could do something with that here and show Riker a manifestation of his son. That would tie perfectly to the earlier scene in which he said that he never saw any proof of an afterlife, to suddenly see his son come back from the dead, basically, and then maybe asking him directly to help them out to save the ship, and then have that whole swarm of aliens appear to help them somehow. Then it could make sense, and that would nicely connect with that storyline of Riker's grief and all of that. Maybe even though later on he will know it was not really his son and probably just a manifestation of those aliens, it will still somehow make him feel better because he got a chance to see his son again, or to have a goodbye scene with him, something like that, which will make him feel better later on. And maybe even thinking, maybe in some way, maybe it is his son, maybe he does still somehow exist on some other plane of reality, something like that, something metaphysical. Maybe it could be too fantastical, too silly, but I think it could have worked. And when I had that idea, I immediately made that video that I put on my other channel of Riker seeing his son. I used that fake son he had in the episode Future Imperfect, and showing as if that son came back to help him somehow and all of that. So I think if they actually did something like that, it could have been very emotional and satisfying scene. The way they did it here is that Riker simply regained his mojo simply because he saw those jellyfish being born in space, and that's it. That's what restored his faith in the wonders of the universe or something. But he saw a million things like that in the show. So how is this any different? So if they actually had the scene of him talking with his dead son somehow, through those aliens who gave them what he wants to see, so they gave him a vision of his son, and then he talks with his son, which actually is talking with those aliens, and asking the son to help, and then the aliens help them escape, and then later on he would say that he felt as if he's actually talking with his real son, even though he knows it's the aliens, but maybe on some level his son still exists somewhere in the universe, in the multiverse or whatever, and that's what restores his faith or something. And then it could be much more emotional, much more epic, much more interesting in my opinion. So I think that was a big missed opportunity, when instead it was just a happy coincidence that the jellyfish in space happened to be born at exactly that same time they needed them to, and just escape on some wave without any conscious decision by any alien to help them out. So that, I think, was a missed opportunity, just like many things in this episode, especially with the Changeling thing, which could have been an epic episode similar to the DS9 episode The Adversary, which is a great episode, by the way, and instead the Changeling in this episode was barely an inconvenience, and so that's a huge missed opportunity, a huge disappointment in my opinion. So I don't hate this episode, I still think it's good in many ways, but it could have been much better, and so that's why I am disappointed by this episode. And I'm once again really concerned about the rest of the season, because even though there's some good stuff here, there's also all of these small details which they got wrong, and so that makes me really worried about the future of this season. So that's all I had to say about it for now. Let me know what you think, and we can discuss all of this in the comments below, and I will see you all next time. Bye bye.